And as Israel's stock plummeted yet again after Operation Protective Edge, the media began to speculate. The media was actually has been saturated with dire speculations of what's called the world's oldest hatred, namely anti-Semitism, rearing its ugly head again. Well, the fact that we're now in round 4 of the new anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily mean that this particular orchestrated foreboding doesn't necessarily mean that this time it's also just a, let's call it a, I don't want to use the word plot, let's call it, maybe this time it's not a theatrical, but maybe there's something to it. And in order to investigate whether there's something to it, you really have to look at the details. You have to look at the various polls that have been done, the various kinds of evidence that have been adduced. So that's going to be part of our assignment this evening, to start going through some of the evidence and then judging for yourself whether this evidence actually supports the claim that there is a new anti-Semitism, or whether this is simply being contrived and orchestrated in order to, as in the past, to squelch and deflect global condemnation of Israeli atrocities. So, one of the pieces of evidence that's frequently cited is what's called a YouGov, the Y-O-U-G-O-V, a YouGov poll. It's an official government polling service in the United Kingdom. And this polling service claimed that it found evidence of pervasive anti-Semitism among the British population. And they reached this conclusion based on the reaction of the British public to several statements. So let's take some examples. 17% of respondents, that means 17% of Brits, believed that, and now I'm quoting the poll, quote, Jews think they are better than other people. 17% of the respondents said yes, they agreed with that statement. Jews think they are better than other people, and that's proof that at least 17% of the British public is anti-Semitic. But between the spectacular success of Jews in the Western world on the one hand, and the belief in a theological chosenness on the other, in fact, most Jews themselves believe in their group superiority. That's why Jews, present speaker included, like to kfel, that's the Yiddish word for boast or brag, over the Jewish pedigree of 20% of Nobel laureates. I still remember as a child being very proud of the fact that the seminal figures of modernity, Marx, Einstein, and Freud, they were all Jewish. And if any of my non-Jewish friends had any doubts about the superiority of Jews, I would also, of course, include the fact that Jesus was a Jew. So that would make the 4 seminal figures of modernity all being Jewish. If it were true that the belief that Jews think that they are superior is proof of anti-Semitism, the inexorable corollary would have to be that most Jews are anti-Semitic because they think they are better than other people. Let's take another proof from the British poll. 10% of respondents, quote, would be unhappy if a family member married a Jew. 10% of British respondents said they would be unhappy if a family member married a Jew. So that's supposed to prove that 10% of the British public is anti-Semitic. But what's most telling about the percentage is how low it is. It's very easy to predict a qualitatively higher percentage if the prospect posed to respondents was, would you be unhappy if a member of your family married a Muslim? Or a member of your family married an African? Almost certainly, the finding would rise to at least 50 or 70% for those two possibilities. In fact, the fact that Jewish intermarriage nowadays causes so little ado among non-Jews, that suggests just how marginal anti-Semitism has become as a phenomenon in the Western world. Indeed, the one group that is visibly upset at the prospect of intermarriage is not the dominant culture, it's the Jewish community. Among Orthodox Jews, it's called the silent Holocaust because it's eliminating the Jewish people through intermarriage. And if that were really a criterion of anti-Semitism or bigotry, namely opposition to intermarriage, then what do you make of the 2011 poll of Israeli Jews, which found that fully 75% opposed intermarriage? Even among secular Israeli Jews, nearly 2/3 opposed intermarriage. Then there was a third finding. 17% of British respondents believe that, quote, Jews have too much power in the media. Now, this particular proof of anti-Semitism, it's also widely reported in the US context, where in answer to the same question, a significant number of Americans reply, yes, they think Jews have too much power in the media. But the fact of the matter is even the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, Abraham Foxman wrote in his book, The New Anti-Semitism, he says, yes, it's true, Jews are proportionately overrepresented as a group in influential media, whether it be Hollywood, book publishing, opinion journals, or newspapers. Now, according to Mr. Foxman, it may be true that Jews are overrepresented, he says, but it has no cultural repercussions because he says if you're in a position of power, say in Hollywood, your only concern is the bottom line, whether the film will sell, whether the film will bring in profits. But is it really so far-fetched to posit a link between the overrepresentation of Jews, say in Hollywood, and the media's obsessive focus on the Holocaust, putting all other human suffering in the shade? So let's take a simple statistical fact. During the past 3 decades, the US has released more than 3 times as many films on the Nazi Holocaust, 110, as on US slavery and the US atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and US slavery, there are about 36 films in the last 3 decades. On the Nazi Holocaust, 110. I don't personally have a subscription to Netflix, but my sister-in-law gives me her password, and I can download what's on the home page for free. And my impression is, perhaps slightly biased, my impression is every 3rd film available for download, even in romantic comedies, seems to be about the Holocaust. Now, if you're one of those politically correct people, one of those liberals, then it's perfectly fair in liberal precincts, politically correct liberal precincts, it's perfectly fair to say white people, as against people of color, they have too much power in the media. Or it's perfectly correct to say men, as against women, they have too much power in the media. because everybody understands that if you're a man against a woman, you're going to have a natural propensity, there's going to be a kind of natural propensity to give unfair time to yourself, your group, your gender. So it's perfectly fine to say white people as against people of color have too much power in the media, or men as against women have too much power in the media. Why then does it become anti-Semitic to flag the overrepresentation of Jews in the media? Now I'll just look at one other of these proofs of anti-Semitism. 13% of respondents believe that, quote, Jews talk about the Holocaust too much in order to get sympathy. Well, when I looked at that finding, I wasn't disturbed at the 13% who agreed with the statement. I was disturbed, however, by the 87% who did agree with this statement, because I thought there was something seriously wrong with their mental faculty if they didn't think Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. In fact, I think most Jews think Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. If you state the obvious, it's not anti-Semitism. It's just an empirical observation. None of these British survey findings, they prove a resurgence of anti-Semitism. At most, they are indeterminate. The affirmative responses might be indicative of a deep-seated irrational loathing of Jews, but they also might not be. They might just be matter-of-fact statements, many of which happen to be true. It's also important to keep in mind that most of these sorts of findings, they're also socially inconsequential. So it's not pleasant, for example, to be perceived as most Jews are. They're perceived as cheap. It's not a pleasant thing to have to deal with. I know from my speaking strictly for myself, I'll admit it to being anecdotal and perhaps eccentric evidence. I know, speaking for myself, whenever I go to my corner grocer and I purchase a bag of chips for 99 cents, I give the grocer $1 and I try it in as nonchalant a way as I can, but very self-consciously I say, keep the penny. Because you have that particular stigma, Jews are cheap. But then you have to ask yourself how many doors are closed to Jews on account of this stereotype, which seems to me the most important question. I was thinking this morning while I was making use of your wonderful swimming facility. I'm an awful swimmer, but I can appreciate a nice facility, just like I was awful at the piano, but I can appreciate a good pianist. And while I was swimming, I was thinking to myself about the remark once made by the response Martin Luther King gave once. Somebody said to him, Dr. King, you keep having all these sit-ins and you keep having all these protests. He says, white people are not going to like you. And his response was, well, first of all, I want white people to stop lynching us, and then I'll worry about whether they like us. And I think that was a correct order of moral and political priorities. Yes, it might be a case that Jews have certain stereotypes associated with Jews which are unpleasant, not nice. But then the real question is, obviously Jews are not being lynched, but the really consequential question is it closing doors to Jews? Are Jews missing out on opportunities because of these stigmas? In fact, quite the contrary. Jews are so tapped into networks of power and privilege that being Jewish nowadays, far from being a liability, it's actually social cachet. So when she married Mark Lesvinsky, no one pitied Chelsea Clinton for slipping a rung on the social ladder. If it's not easy being a Jew, it's a lot easier to bear than the cross of being short, being fat, being bald, or being ugly. Most people carrying one or another social stigma they learn to cope with it. It's called life. And by and large, being Jewish falls on this spectrum of stigmata, at the benign end. Anybody knows, if they're not totally blinded by political correctness, that if you're ugly in society, it closes a lot more doors than being Jewish. If you are fat or obese in our society, it closes a lot more doors. But those are, in my opinion, those are not pleasant things, but they're sort of what you would call God's roll of the dice, and you learn to live with them. Still, as against what I've just asserted, there is a vast complex of Jewish and philo-Jewish organizations, mostly affiliated with Israel, who claim there's been an explosion of anti-Semitic incidents in the world. And I did take the time, as I have on several occasions in the past, I'll admit to having written a book, a third of which was devoted to this topic in 2005. So I looked at some of the standard reports. So there's this Tel Aviv University Cantor Center, and each year it issues a report called Antisemitism Worldwide. And it said that we're now passing through a phase of an explosion of anti-Semitic incidents. So, of course, I was curious in the details. It said that there was, this is 2013, was the last report that's been out, for the year 2013. It said there was a global total of 25 anti-Semitic incidents involving a weapon in 2013. 25 anti-Semitic incidents involving a weapon. Not necessarily anyone was killed, but involved a weapon in 2013. Now, maybe I'm a little jaded as a New Yorker, but in my living memory, 40 New Yorkers used to be killed every week, died in homicides. We used to have about 2,200 homicides a year, or 40 a week, for a population of 7.5 million. So I have to say I was slightly underwhelmed by 25 anti-Semitic incidents involving a weapon in 2013 among 7 billion people. It didn't strike me as compelling evidence of an explosion of anti-Semitism, let alone that we're verging on another Holocaust. If you look at most of the evidence of this new anti-Semitism, a lot of it is trivial, a lot of it is nebulous, a lot of it is exaggerated, and if you judge by past research, a lot of it is just fabricated. But let's take some examples of what they claim is new anti-Semitism. So I'm quoting from this Tel Aviv report. 1, Russia still does not recognize the uniqueness of the Holocaust. That's proof of anti-Semitism in Russia. Not trying to extenuate anything for the Russians, but first of all, the fact that you don't recognize it as unique does not necessarily obviously make you a Holocaust, make you an anti-Semite, let alone a Holocaust denier. But in the case of Russia, maybe one reason they don't recognize the uniqueness of the Nazi Holocaust is because probably about 30 million Russians were killed during World War II. They say a Brazilian caricaturist published a series of cartoons claiming that anti-Semitism is exploited by the Israel lobby for political gain. Now, you can judge for yourself whether that's evidence of anti-Semitism or whether it's a perfectly reasonable, in my opinion, correct statement. They say there's an outburst of anti-Semitism in Chile. What's the evidence? It's still no crime to sell anti-Semitic books in Chile. Well, my guess is it's no crime to sell anti-Semitic books in Madison, Wisconsin. Now, there's also been troubling evidence of anti-Semitism in Spain. A Madrid public school held a market where they sold, among other objects, banners with swastikas and patches with the emblem of the SS, which is probably also what you can get on eBay, if I'm not mistaken, which would make eBay also anti-Semitic. And finally, a German newspaper published a caricature of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu showing him poisoning the dove of the Middle East peace. That's evidence of anti-Semitism. As a friend of mine pointed out, the very same people who claim it's anti-Semitic to show a caricature of Netanyahu poisoning the dove of peace, it's the very same sorts of people who claim it's heroic for the Charlie Hebdo editors to publish pornographic caricatures of Muhammad. In any event, if this is anti-Semitism, then to quote Gloria Gaynor's immortal refrain, Jews will survive. It might also be noted it's the very rare public figure who nowadays is not smeared with the epithet of anti-Semite. So in recent times, Jimmy Carter has been called an anti-Semite, Barack Obama has been called an anti-Semite, Pope Francis has been called an anti-Semite, Kenneth Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, has been called an anti-Semite, and closer to the home of more of the young people in this room, Penelope Cruz and Javier Bardem. Is that correct? Did I get that right? I don't know who they are, but they're also called anti-Semites. I wanted to throw in something for people under the age of 30. As a matter of fact, I myself am classified in most of the standard compendia of global anti-Semitism. According to Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, I'm a leading and damaging source of anti-Semitism. According to probably the world's leading authority, Robert Wistrich, I am the go-to Jewish icon for Islamists, neo-Nazis, Holocaust deniers, and deluded leftists, which, if nothing else, it does accurately convey the virulence of the new strain of anti-Semitism. Now, it's often claimed that there's no connection whatsoever, no causal nexus between Israeli actions and anti-Semitism. That you can't blame it on Israel. There's no connection between the two. There's no connection between the spikes in Israeli violence against Palestinians and the upticks in anti-Semitic violence. But in fact, if you go through the evidence collected over many years, that's exactly what the evidence does show. Each time Israel launches another of its murderous assaults, anti-Semitic incidents peak in Europe, and are often perpetrated by disaffected, angry Muslim youth. If in recent times a larger fraction of these incidents are violent, it's the blowback from the brutish fanaticism currently plaguing the Arab Muslim world. Now, if you're really concerned about these spurts of anti-Semitism and you want to contain them, then there are obvious things you can do. Number one, Israel can cease carrying out massacres. If it stopped carrying out massacres, the number of incidents, judging by all the evidence we have, because the evidence shows there's a correlation, another Israeli massacre, another uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. So one thing, if you're concerned about the outbursts of anti-Semitism, one thing you can do is Israel can stop carrying out massacres. Another thing is Israel can simply stop calling itself a Jewish state, so Jews wouldn't have to bear the burden for its criminal actions. And the third thing is official Jewish organizations in the diaspora, they could cease defending Israel's criminal actions, and then it won't appear as if Israel, when it carries out these actions, is acting in the name of the Jewish people. Things haven't been helped by the fact that Mr. Netanyahu, in a new phase of his megalomania, he now has donned the mantle. He's gone around the past month or so. He now calls himself the representative of the entire Jewish people. When Muslim youths in Europe take him at his word and they exact revenge on those whom he claims to represent, it might not be right, but it's not surprising either. Meanwhile, Mr. Netanyahu, he says that a disaster looms for the Jews of Europe, and they're an endangered species, and they need to migrate to the safe shores of their homeland in Israel. So in particular, he's been counseling the French Jews, which are the largest constituent of European Jews, about 500,000. He's telling them to come home to the safety of their homeland. But I have to say it doesn't make quite too much sense to me, because according to Mr. Netanyahu, the Jewish state is now confronting an imminent Holocaust from Iran. So why would you be telling everybody to come home? I think you would tell them to go away. But as all of you know, because you're college students, the claim of a new anti-Semitism, it's not only being directed at Europe, it's being directed at the United States, in particular American college campuses. Before I met with you this evening, I had dinner with several people, and several members of the Students for Justice in Palestine, and I asked them, would you prefer for me to speak on this topic, or should I speak on what happened in Gaza? And there seemed to be a consensus that it was important to speak on this topic because campus organizations which are trying to defend the elementary rights of Palestinians are right now being tarred with the brush of being anti-Semitic. Indeed, no lesser a publication than the New York Times, which, if there be a God, will soon be going broke. The New York Times reported last week, and now I'm quoting, a surge of hostile sentiment directed against Jews at many campuses in the country. And that's an authoritative, what's called newspaper of record. And of course, I was curious to look at the evidence, and in fact, a recent study was released. It found that, and now I'm quoting the study, 54% of Jewish college students personally experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism during the 2013 to 14 academic year. That's a large number. 54% said they experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism, actually they said, in one 6-month period. So let's look at the breakdown. Let's, for the moment, let's set aside, in my opinion, you can judge for yourself, the fairly trivial result that 29% of those surveyed experienced anti-Semitism, quote, from an individual student. From an individual student. That means some student may have made a tasteless joke, used a politically incorrect phrase, or even worse, but it's one student. It's not yet Kristallnacht, let alone Auschwitz. It's one student. Beyond that, this is what the survey found. 10% experienced anti-Semitism in clubs or societies. Now, according to the survey, a large number of people said the mere existence of a BDS or an SJP on campus, a club or society like that, that in itself is evidence of anti-Semitism. 10% said they found anti-Semitism in other contexts, namely email or graffiti. Well, email, you get an email that's anti-Semitic and the sky is falling. It's hard to react to things like that. I wish someone would vet my email, what I get in the morning, and I still feel very safe in the United States. 4% experienced anti-Semitism in a student union, 6% in a lecture class, and 3% in the administrative system. if you discount from these tiny percentages, 4%, 3%, 6% of Jews who were surveyed, if you discount from those tiny percentages those who conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and Jewish hypersensitivity on the topic. I'm hypersensitive on the topic. Any Jew is, there's a historical reason why, but it's still hypersensitivity. Anyone who has any doubts about it, go watch Woody Allen's Annie Hall, and you'll see what hypersensitivity is. There's a reason for it, but it's also hypersensitivity. If you discount those who conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel and the hypersensitivity, the real news from this survey is anti-Semitism on college campuses, it approaches zero. In fact, anti-Semitism has been vanquished on college campuses. And then if you turn to the critical question, not a student saying a nasty remark, which, as I said, it's unpleasant. I recognize that. But if you are obese and somebody makes a nasty remark about fat people, it's also unpleasant, and you live with it. If you take the really critical question, which in my view, we can disagree, I'm from an older generation, the issue is opportunity in higher education. Once you look at that critical question, Jews can scarcely sustain a claim to discrimination. Although Jews make up about 2% of the US population, if you take the case of the Ivy Leagues, 40% of the Jewish students in Columbia and University of Pennsylvania, they're Jewish. 2% of the population, 40% of the student population in Columbia University and University of Pennsylvania are Jewish. 20 to 25% of the Yale, Harvard, and Cornell student populations are Jewish. 13 to 20% of Dartmouth, Princeton, and Brown are Jewish. This is hardly evidence of anti-Semitism. In fact, it is arguable. I won't say it's been proven, but a good argument has been made, a compelling argument has been made, that in fact Jewish representation in the Ivy Leagues has been a case of Jews being beneficiaries of reverse discrimination in their favor, while Asian Americans have been by far the actual victims of discriminatory admissions policies. Now, as everybody knows, the main claim about this resurgent anti-Semitism is the claim that Jew hatred lurks behind much of the denunciation of Israel. So let's see how this works itself out in practice. One influential definition of anti-Semitism says that these are proofs, these are examples of anti-Semitism masquerading itself as criticism of Israel. So let's see. One is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. If you deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, then you are guilty of anti-Semitism. So let's see if that's true. Israel's leading historian, Benny Morris, he said that transfer or expulsion of the indigenous population, he said it was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. Those are his words. The expulsion of the indigenous population of Palestine, says the leading Israeli historian Benny Morris, he says, quote, it was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. Now, some of you may know Israel's leading liberal columnist, Ari Shavit. He just came out with a book which had huge resonance in the United States, sold very well, excerpted in the New Yorker magazine and got rave reviews. It was called My Promised Land. And what's the central thesis of My Promised Land? It was that if Zionism was to be, the Palestinians could not be. If Zionism was to be, the Palestinians could not be. The upshot is that for Jews to realize their right to self-determination by Israel's founding, it did inherently entail the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population. That's not anti-Semitism. That, according to Israel's leading historian and Israel's leading liberal commentator, Ari Shavet, that's just a fact. Now we're told that drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, that's proof that whereas it appears to be criticism of Israel, it's really anti-Semitism. But Israel itself routinely depicts its antagonists, including Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. It says day in and day out, they are reincarnations of Hitler, and they're Nazi-like. If you do as I did the other day, a Google search of the keywords Netanyahu, Iran, Nazi, you'll get 800,000 results. So does that mean only Israel is entitled to make the comparison between its enemies and Hitler or the Nazis, but when it's done by the other side, it becomes anti-Semitism? Then we're told, if you hold Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, you're guilty of anti-Semitism. But by representing itself as the state of the Jewish people, Israel itself collectively implicates Jews in its actions. Just as when Netanyahu calls himself the representative of the entire Jewish people, by doing so, he's collectively implicating Jews. The bottom line is, none of these examples prove that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. So far, I've gone through what I would call the easy case, because these kinds of findings are just, frankly, they're nonsense. And no serious person could give them, or should give them, the time of day. But I don't like the easy cases, because they're too easy. They're not even mentally challenging. I'm more interested in the tough cases. And so in the time that remains, I want to look at the tough case. The tough case goes something like this. Everybody's heard it, and on its face, in my opinion, it's not altogether without merit. It says, the world is replete, it's full of worse cases of oppression and repression than Palestine. I think that's true at some level. If the international community focuses, it said, obsessively on Israel, it must be due to anti-Semitism or an anti-Jewish bias. That's the argument. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, has heard it. And now let's try rationally to go through the argument and see where we end up. The first point to make is that during the apartheid era, South Africa also alleged that it was being unfairly singled out. The African continent, South African whites said, and it was true, they said it was dotted with one-party dictatorships, and it said, and it was true, that South African blacks fared better economically than many of their counterparts elsewhere in the Arab world. And now in significant circles, Israel has replaced South Africa as the defining moral issue of our time. And now the identical charge of a double standard is being leveled by Israel. Why are we being singled out? And in fact, As everybody in this room knows, Israel is now being accused of practicing apartheid, and the popular BDS movement sees itself as the lineal successor of the anti-apartheid sanctions campaign, which I'm sure was popular here in the 1980s, as it was when I attended graduate school elsewhere. And in fact, the South African struggle and the Palestine struggle, they have much in common. The South African struggle was first spearheaded by the African continent, because everybody on the African continent, every black person on the African continent, experienced apartheid, the idea of apartheid, as a personal affront, a personal insult, and because apartheid was perceived as a running sore from the humiliating era of Western colonialism. In the same way, Palestine, it was initially spearheaded by the Arab world, where the Zionist dispossession of the indigenous population, it deeply resonated among the Arab people, and Israel's founding was also perceived as a festering wound from the imperialist epoch. However, when the South African struggle and the Palestine struggle, when they were adopted by the international community, when they became the great struggles of their eras, the international community, it did not deny the settlers, whether it be in South Africa or in Palestine, it did not deny them their acquired rights. It didn't say they had to leave. The white settlers did not have to leave. The Jewish settlers did not have to leave. A right of place was conferred on both the white settlers in South Africa and the Jewish settlers in Palestine. In the case of Palestine, the right of place that was conferred by the international community was remarkably generous, because the Zionists had only come about 50 years earlier, roughly around 1900. The right of place to them was conferred by the partition resolution. In the case of South Africa, it had come 500 years earlier, 5 centuries earlier. So in the case of the Zionist settlers, the international community, in the partition resolution of 1947, it was very generous to them. In fact, the international community gave them, they represented about 1/3 of the population at the time. The international community awarded them 56% of Palestine. So, at that point, the international community was very generous to the Israeli Jews, the Jews in Palestine. And from that period on, the international community was not hostile to Israel. Quite the contrary. It displayed leniency, forgivingness, even magnanimity. The first act of the Israeli state, its very first act, was to eviscerate the partition resolution. They were awarded 50%, 56% of Palestine. By the end of the war, they had conquered 80% of Palestine. The partition resolution said that the Arabs in the prospective Jewish state, they were supposed to get equal rights. That's what the resolution said. The first thing the Zionist movement did was it expelled 90% of the indigenous population of Palestine and denied them the right to return when battlefield hostilities had terminated. What did the UN do? The international community, it proceeded to admit Israel to the United Nations. And there was no movement underfoot in the 1950s to expel them. So the international community accepted that Israel had grossly violated the UN partition resolution, and there were no sanctions, there were no consequences at all imposed on Israel. Then, in 1967, the UN passed Resolution 242. For those of you who know the wording of it, it begins by saying it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Well, Israel acquired 80% of Palestine when they were awarded 56%. They acquired it by war. Did the UN say they have to return the territory they had acquired in 1948? No. The UN said they were only responsible to return the territory that they had occupied in the recent conflict, meaning in 1967. So once again, the international community was very generous to Israel. And that generosity continues till this day, because the international community has endorsed a two-state settlement that requires Israel only to withdraw to its 1967 borders and not to its borders as they were delineated in the partition resolution. Furthermore, Israel clearly breached the UN Charter and international law in 1967 when it launched the first strike against Egypt. Did the UN condemn Israel for aggression in 1967? No, it did not. In fact, there was a big debate at the UN. Since Israel had committed an aggression, should it be forced to withdraw from the territories it occupied, namely the Egyptian Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights? Shouldn't they be forced to immediately and unconditionally withdraw? What was the decision of the UN? The decision was no. In an act of high-minded statesmanship, the UN said Israel only had to withdraw when the neighboring Arab states terminated their belligerency against Israel. That not only was Israel duty-bound to withdraw, because it's inadmissible to acquire territories by war, but they don't have to withdraw until the Arab states renounce their belligerency against Israel. So, in every respect, all the way we're now up until the late 1960s, this international community was not hostile to Israel. It was remarkably lenient and forgiving to Israel. Let's take another example. As some of you know, the South African regime, the apartheid regime, it itself attempted the idea of a two-state settlement, its own version of it. It said we would have a white majority state, and then we'd have these black states called Bantustans for the black people. A kind of two-state settlement, it was called. The international community completely rejected it. They said in the case of South Africa, they would only accept a unitary single state for blacks and whites. But what did the international community do when it came to Palestine? It said, yes, we support a Palestinian state, but only in the West Bank and Gaza, not instead of Israel, but next to Israel, affirming the partition resolution support for the creation of an independent Arab and Jewish state. So here there was a double standard. South Africa, the international community said, has to be one state. But Palestine, the international community said, no, two states. And the international community did have a double standard, but it was a double standard of which Israel was, until this day, still is the beneficiary. Even if you take what was the heyday of anti-imperialism and the non-aligned movement during the 1970s, even during that period, there was never an attempt to actually call for a single state in Palestine. On the contrary, when Yasser Arafat came to the UN around 1974, he came to the UN, but there was a condition. The condition was Arafat had to discard the Palestinian charter, which called for one state, and he had to accept the two-state settlement. Well, some of you are thinking, but, okay, that may have been true up until the 1970s, but certainly the international community has been hostile in recent years. There's no doubt about that. The question is why? And the answer is the reason the international community became hostile is because they felt they were duped. They were hoodwinked. They were tricked. They agreed, they accepted the principle that Israel didn't have to withdraw until the Arab states renounced their belligerency. But then what happened? The Arab states renounced their belligerency, and Israel refused to withdraw. And so that's when the international community, shortly after the '67 war, began to turn against Israel. Not because they were anti-Semitic, but because the Israeli government refused to abide by the terms of 242 and refused to withdraw after the Arab states agreed to recognize Israel. Still, the question remains, hasn't Israel been unfairly targeted? You can say many more innocents have been killed by Arabs in Syria and Darfur. You can say not just Palestinians, but Tibetans, Kashmiris, Kurds. They also suffer under foreign occupations. So why does the public fixate on Israel? That, to me, is a reasonable question. How do you account for this discrepancy? If I were to have a meeting here about Tibetans, Kurds, or Tibetans, Kurds, and Kashmiris, you'd probably fill the first two rows. But it's different. Why is it that the public fixates on Israel? South Africa, the claim is they fixate on it because of anti-Semitism. So anybody in this room beyond the first two rows must be here because they hate Jews. Now, South Africa also bemoaned its pariah status, and in some technical sense, it probably was unfair to single them out. But it would have been ludicrous to argue that it was anti-whiteism that mobilized the international community against South Africa. So why assume it must be anti-Semitism that mobilizes the international community against Israel? It is true, it's hard to figure out why a particular local struggle, why it metamorphoses into an international cause célèbre. You can't prove that with mathematical precision. How do you prove that one people's suffering is the worst? You can't do it, obviously. But surely the Palestine struggle possesses sufficient appalling features in its own right, such that anti-Semitism doesn't have to be dragged in to explain why so many people turned out today. So let's look at some of the possible explanations. First, if you eliminate the terrorism background noise, it's really hard to come up with a more pristine, pure instance of injustice. My late mother, who knew something about suffering in her life, I used to lecture with her during the late 1980s and early 1990s in the first Intifada. She passed through the Nazi Holocaust. She was in Majdanek concentration camp and several slave labor camps. Her whole family was exterminated during the war, and she would speak on the Nazis and the Jews. I generally spoke in Jewish venues, and the audience was enraptured by my late mother. She was both quite eloquent, but she was also very smart, insightful, and never given to the cliche. And after she finished speaking on the Nazis and the Jews, I would rise to speak on Israel and the Palestinians with a certain symmetry intended. And after hearing me, of course, the audience was appalled, shocked, disgusted, and finally one member of an audience summoned up the courage, and it does take a lot of courage to ask the Jewish mother of her Jewish son, "What do you think of what he's saying?" And she paused for a moment, and then she said, "What crime did Palestinians commit except to be born in Palestine?" And that, to me, I think, summarizes the essence of the conflict. When you, as I say, eliminate the background noise, the only crime the Palestinians committed was to be born in Palestine. Second, there's the longevity of the conflict. It's in a class all its own. If you date it from the Balfour Declaration, it's a century already, 100 years. If you date it from what's called the Nakba, or the founding of Israel, it's 7 decades already. If you date it from Israel's occupation, it's 5 decades already. If you date it from when I first got involved, it's now 3 decades already. And for me, it's a sobering fact that it's consumed my entire adult life, not to mention my professional career. Third, the various phases and facets of the Palestine struggle, they embrace the gamut of human misery. There's ethnic cleansing, there's foreign occupation, there's a merciless siege, there's massacre, there's torture, there's humiliation. Fourth, there is the inequity of the conflict. It has a kind of biblical resonance. Is it not David versus Goliath when a tiny, battered people does battle with a regional superpower backed by the global superpower? Fifth, there's just the sheer cruelty and heartlessness which must bewilder and boggle. In the past decade, the past 10 years, Israel has unleashed the full force of its high-tech killing machine on what British Conservative Prime Minister Cameron called a giant open-air prison in Gaza. 80% of the people in Gaza, 80%, are classified as refugees. 60% of the people of Gaza are classified as children. 80% refugees, 60% children in a giant open-air prison. In the past 10 years, Israel has launched 8 operations, unleashing the full force of its high-tech killing machine 8 times. Operation Rainbow, 2004. Operation Days of Penitence, 2004. Operation Summer Rains, 2006. Operation Autumn Clouds, 2006. Operation Hot Winter, 2008. Operation Cast Lead, 2008-9. Operation Pillar of Defense, 2012. Operation Protective Edge, 2014. Sixth, there's the incommensurability of the suffering, which makes mockery of affectations and balance. Take this past summer, Operation Protective Edge. 538 Palestinian children were killed. 538. 1 Israeli child was killed. And then we're told we have to be balanced. about what's happening there. Palestine might not represent the only epitome of human suffering in the contemporary world, but it surely qualifies as a worthy candidate. What is more, so much of the world now yearns, in the slogan of my own generation, to give peace a chance. Israel yearns to give war a chance, and another chance, and another chance. Is there a day, literally a day, that goes by without Israel contemplating yet another attack on Gaza or Lebanon, or now an attack on Iran? Israel flouts the global consensus supporting a two-state solution by appropriating and incorporating the last remnants of Palestine. Israel's current head of state is an obnoxious, loudmouthed Jewish supremacist, while the Israeli people, in the words of Israeli columnist Gideon Levy, they shoot and cry, love themselves to death, and pity themselves ad nauseum. Don't Israel's singular warmongering, brazenness, and self-righteous arrogance themselves accentuate the conflict's image as one of pure good versus pure evil? If Palestine has become the emblematic cause of our time, it's not because of a new anti-Semitism, although, no doubt, some anti-Semites have infiltrated its ranks. It's because the martyrdom of Palestine and the meanness of Israel are so wrong. Thank you. Now I have one precondition for questions, which is I like to take dissenters first. Everybody here was extremely polite and respectful, and some people probably found a lot of what I had to say distasteful, but sat quietly and respectfully. So I think they're going to be setting up microphones. Can we first have, let's say, the first three or four questions from dissenters, and then we'll just throw it open to everyone. So anyone who would like to ask a question or express his or her sharp or mild criticism should go first. Okay. I think there's going to be a microphone.
Okay. Hi, my name is Tina. I'm a member of SJP. I'm going to be bringing the microphone around to people who have questions or comments. If you have a question, if you could raise your fist, I will prioritize you. If you have a comment, raise an open hand, and we will try to get to those after we've gotten the questions out first. So I'm going to start by asking people to raise hands. I will write you down, and I will get to the first 5 or 6 people, and then I will take another list once we've gotten those questions out while Dr. Finkelstein is responding. So I'll gladly start with the center, and I see a question here. And again, fist if you have questions. Thanks.
Hi. Whoa, that was loud. Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Noah. I'm Jewish, that may be obvious, I don't know. You made a lot of points in the beginning about the hypocrisy of Jews in general, and arrogance and oversensitivity, and I understood those points, although I confess I'm sort of upset by them, but I understood your points. But I was wondering what these arguments accomplish in terms of the peace effort and how they're constructive, because I didn't feel anything constructive personally, as my emotional response was sort of viscerally, ugh. Thank you.
Well, I think the question is whether a new undertaking is afoot to deflect legitimate criticism of Israel by tagging it as being anti-Semitic, and thereby squelching on college campuses, where I think it's correct to say there's broad public support now for the Palestinian side, not the Palestinian side, for recognition of Palestinian rights. It's been a very encouraging development, in my opinion, again, reminiscent of the campus activity against apartheid in the 1980s. And it would be deeply regrettable if those achievements and accomplishments are now squelched or reversed because this campaign of a new anti-Semitism is being used for that purpose. And therefore, I think it is a useful thing to go through the record and see whether or not there is any basis for this claim. Now, you can disagree with that. I think it's a useful exercise, but of course, people have the right to disagree.
Okay, I'm actually going to ask that people, once I point to you, come and line up, just because it's going to be a little bit easier to facilitate. Thanks. So you're next. All right. Actually.
So, first I'd like to, well, my name is Michael. I'd like to thank you for coming here to teach us about the conflict 45 minutes after you start your speech. And also, I'd like to urge those of you who have additional questions about some viewpoints that Dr. Finkelstein completely ignored to research this topic further before you form an opinion. Now, Dr. Finkelstein, you claim to support democracy, but instead of seeking democratic change and looking for ways to peace, instead you spread hateful messages and skew facts and make statements such as, quote, Israel must endure defeat like Japan and Germany at the end of World War II so that they may be knocked back to their senses, end quote. Now, would Nazi Germany allow a minority party to run in national elections? Would they allow a minority member to hold a seat in the Supreme Court, one that oversees the elections? This doesn't sound the same, and I'd like to thank you for recording this, by the way. Yes, I see you. Now, it doesn't seem that you're very interested in peace. It seems more that you're interested in undermining Israel and attacking it. And before you respond to my question, I would please ask that you focus on my question and not on ad hominem attacks. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask you, just for the sake of clarity, which aspect of your statement would you like me to focus on? I want to directly answer it, but there were several aspects to what you said. So which aspect would you like me to focus on?
Well, one, you are very obviously towards one issue and omit many facts. Just one example, when you're going through polls, you mention numbers and then make estimates for other polls. You don't provide actual numbers, but what I'd specifically like to ask you about is how come instead of going through peaceful means and trying to achieve democratic change, you make statements like Israel must experience something like a nuclear bomb being dropped on them in order to go back to their senses?
Okay, I'm going to set aside the question of whether I accurately represented the polls because that seemed the secondary issue. And let's look at the primary issue, namely the last thing you said. There is, in my opinion, little doubt that Israelis are now suffering a kind of giddiness and disconnection from reality. And there's an element of, you would say, as I said at the end, an element of warmongering, brazenness, defiance of the international community. And it's very difficult to conceive exactly how you shake them out of this particular mood. If you look at the polls, for example, I'll start with, I won't even go back to Lebanon in 1982 because there's so much misunderstanding about that famous 400,000 march in 1982. Let's look at the period most people are familiar with. If we look at the period 2002 Operation Defensive Shield, 2006 Operation, the attack on Lebanon in 2006, July and August, 34 days attack on Lebanon. If you look at 2007-8 Operation Protective Shield, 2014 Operation Protective Edge. In every single one of those cases, if you look at the Israeli polls, approximately 90% or more, frequently more, something like 92, 94% of the Israeli population supported each of those atrocities, each of those criminal acts of aggression. Or you're going to have to let me finish, okay? And then you have to ask yourself, what can shake Israelis from this kind of war psychosis? And, we call it supremacist psychosis, of which there's, I think, ample evidence if you go through the Israeli polls, which was a huge amount of material. And what I said was, I want to be clear, yes, I did speculate that it's hard to imagine anything except a significant military defeat shaking Israel free from this kind of supremacist psychosis, because for Israel, most of these assaults have just been cost-free. If you take the case of Operation Protective Edge, 1,400 Palestinians were killed, up to 1,200 of them were civilians. On the Israeli side, 13 Israelis were killed, 3 civilians, 10 combatants. Of the 10 combatants, 4 of the 10 were killed due to friendly fire, Israelis actually accidentally killing Israelis. If you take the last Israeli attack, 2,200 Palestinians killed, 1,500 of them, about 1,500 or 1,600 were civilians. On the Israeli side, there were 5 civilians killed. 5 civilians killed. These are cost-free operations for Israel. They're just a high-tech killing machine being unleashed on them. And unless they pay a price, of course they're not going to change, because they don't pay any price for it. They don't pay any price for the occupation. The Europeans foot the bills, the Americans do the political blocking, and the Palestinian Authority does the dirty work. These are wars without any consequences for Israel, an occupation without any price by Israel. So of course they're going to continue their merry way until they pay a price. On the other hand, what I also said in the same context, if you allow me to complete the statement I made, what I said was I don't believe in the idea of Israel being carrying with it the mark of Cain or what's sometimes called Israel's original sin, from which it can never extricate itself, free itself. First of all, we live in the United States. We have our own share of original sin, slavery and extermination of the indigenous population. And then I also brought up the examples of Germany and Nazi Germany and Japan. And I made the point, which I've often said, that not to whitewash any of the other Western imperialisms, but I think it's fair to say that among the imperialisms of the 20th century, Germany and Japan, they may not have been qualitatively in a class all their own, but they were certainly quantitatively in a class all their own. Germany, as I said, killed about 30 to 40 million Russians. Japan killed about, I think current estimate is about 30 million Chinese. It was very ugly. Why do I mention it? Because if you look at opinion polls now, the BBC World Service polls, when people from 36 countries, they're asked, what do you think, which countries in the world do you think have had the most favorable impact on world opinion? Which countries in the world do you think have had the most unfavorable impact, in world affairs? Favorable, unfavorable. Unfavorable, it's always the same. It's always Iran, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. They're always at the bottom. Interestingly, at the top is almost always Japan and Germany, having the most favorable impact in the world. So, if you look at that poll, one thing it suggests is countries can change, and people can change. Countries can change, and people can change. So, I am not one of those who believes in this idea of original sin. I think my own country has changed a lot in my lifetime. The American South, it used to be an extremely ugly place. Now, if you talk to many African Americans, they say they would prefer to live in the South than in the North. It's more civilized, it's more humane. So countries can change. How do you get them to change? Yes, I did speculate at a certain point that I do think Israel needs to get its sense knocked into it. It's gone over the cliff. It's a crazy state. It's a lunatic state. It's a maniacal state. There are only 2 countries in the world right now. There are only 2 countries in the world right now that want a war with Iran. One of them, behind the scenes, is the crazy state of Saudi Arabia. And the other country, right on the front of the stage, is Israel. Now, I have to ask, not to you personally, just as a general rhetorical question, does anybody think that what the world needs now, after Iraq, after the massive generation of, well, first of all, the massive killing of people, the massive generation of refugees, and all the death and destruction that ensued in Iraq, is there anybody on God's earth who thinks what we need now, at this present moment, what's most urgent on our world agenda is a war with Iran? Now, this is not my opinion. Mr. Obama, the US State Department, they keep saying Mr. Netanyahu is not offering any option, any alternative. If we are to follow his agenda, it means a war with Iran. Is that a normal state? Is that a normal statesman? That is, in my opinion, certifiable insanity. And I don't see why, in the name of some sort of political correctness, we should recoil from placing the label of insanity, mania, lunacy, where it quite obviously belongs, on that state. It's a crazy state.
Excuse me, Michael, if we can have other people ask questions, you've taken around 15 minutes. 2 people are behind you, maybe you can approach them later. Thank you.
So in order to maximize debate and to get as many voices heard as possible, I'm going to take the next 3 questions in a row, and then Dr. Finkelstein can respond. So we have 2 people in line already. I would especially prioritize any women or any people from any background we haven't heard from yet. So please raise a fist if you have a question, and I will point to you and invite you down to the line. So again, we're going to go through 3 more questions, and then Dr. Finkelstein will respond.
Sure. Hi, Dr. Finkelstein. Thank you for coming. So you spoke a bit about the attacks that went on at France, but you kind of glossed over a little bit. So I'd like to ask you a few questions about it. So there was the kosher market attack. There was a defacing of Israeli graves. So you spoke a bit about it as far as like Benjamin Netanyahu's statement, but could you go over it a little bit more in depth? And then second, just quick question, could you please tell me what your reaction is to the recent development as far as our congressman sending a letter to Iran? Thank you.
Thanks. Next.
Dr. Finkelstein, we're going to get 2 more people. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for coming. I'm a big fan. I've been following forever. I would like you to define Semitism. If Semitism is a reference to an ancient language, then Arabic, Aramaic, Farsi, and Hebrew all fall under that line. So in that case, Arabs can't really be anti-Semitic if they are Semitic themselves. Secondly, I would like to ask you about the secret alliances between Arab nations with Israel in terms of specific policies they have against Hamas and now against Iran. Thank you.
Okay.
So 3 questions.
Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet? Great.
Young man, I do want to hear from you. We're going to try to be democratic, but you're not going to be shoved aside. I want to hear from you.
Thank you, Dr. Finkelstein. So we hear a lot about the problems that exist currently in the Palestinian territories. What's your vision on solution?
Okay. On the question of what happened in France, I did state in my remarks that in the past couple of years, there has been a more virulent manifestations of these periodic upticks in anti-Semitism whenever Israel launches one of its murderous assaults. And it happened in France, and if it was more brutal than in the past, I said it's because there's a kind of brutish fanaticism which is now plaguing the Arab Muslim world, and it was a kind of blowback from that brutish fanaticism. Is it hard? Is it awful? Yeah, it's horrible. I'm not going to. I don't see there's any point in making any excuses for it. The question is it evidence of a resurgence of anti-Semitism in France? I see exactly zero evidence of it for reasons which I've already gone through. The second question was on anti-Semitism. I don't think we should get hung up on sort of the etymological roots of Semitism. Anti-Semitism, it's not a, for me, it's not a politically important question. It refers to Jews because that's where the expression originated. When it was originated in the late 19th century, it was meant to attack Jews. So when you refer to an anti-Semite, you're referring to someone who doesn't like Jews. To say, well, Arabs are also Semites, it just doesn't seem to me to have any relevance whatsoever, because it's like saying, is a black person literally black? No, black people are not literally black. But when we use the term black, it was used to designate a certain group of people, even if the actual word doesn't precisely denote a black person. So we shouldn't get hung up on these things. Anti-Semitism refers to Jews, big deal. And you find your term for your group and fine. And let's just move on. The third point, the thing about what you refer to the secret alliances is, the fact of the matter is they're not secret alliances anymore. And that's a significant loss to the Palestinians. There used to be a time, say in the 1970s, the Palestine struggle commanded so much resonance in the Arab Muslim world that no Arab leader would dare defy the Palestinian consensus in the 1970s. Even people like Anwar Sadat, somebody I'm reading about now, during the Camp David talks in the late 1970s, he was terrified by signing a separate deal with Israel to get Israel to withdraw from the Sinai, that he was going to alienate the Palestinians, and then he's going to alienate the whole Arab world, and he's going to be completely isolated. That's completely changed. You don't have to speak about secret alliances anymore. During the Israeli attack on Gaza this past summer, Saudi Arabia openly supported Israel. Egypt openly supported Israel. The United Arab Emirates supported Israel. The Arab League only met once during the Israeli assault, and during that one meeting, it basically supported Israel. So the common interest and the common political agenda between Israel and many of the Arab states is no longer something that's sub rosa beneath the ground. It's now an openly expressed fact. The last question was the question of what's my vision of a solution. It's a useful question to ask because I think it's completely misstated. And that's one of the problems with the Palestine movement, or solidarity movement, not with the Palestinians there, but the solidarity movement. There's a tendency to personalize this question and ask, what do you support? Do you support one state or two states, as it's frequently put, as if politics were like a Chinese menu. You say, I'll take one from column A and I'll take two from column B. Politics has nothing whatsoever to do with what I support or what you support, at least not in my opinion. Politics is about the maximum you can hope to achieve in terms of justice, given the current balance of forces and the current state of public opinion. That's what politics comes down to. It's not what you support or what I support. It's a gauging, a judging. Where is the balance of forces in the world today? Where is public opinion in the world today? What's the maximum one can hope to extract? So let's take the case, one simple example. As I said in my remarks, the South African struggle, it initially was spearheaded by the African continent, for whom apartheid was, for each individual African, a personal affront. The Arab struggle was initially spearheaded by the Arab world, for whom the dispossession of the indigenous population had deeply resonated. Once it becomes an international issue, and then you have to ask yourself the question, where does the international community stand on this question? So some people say, I support one state. Okay, you might support one state, but can you show me one state in the world, one, name me one country in the world that supports one state? Name me one. In fact, if you look at Europe, a young collaborator of mine, Jamie Sternweiner, he went through all the debates in the European Parliament, and he looked at what resolutions were being offered by the left-wing parties in Europe, the Greens, Sinn Féin, and so forth. All of them support two states. So how do you expect to achieve this goal of one state in defiance of all of world opinion at the level of states? Who has ever done that? Vietnam was a very heroic struggle, for sure. It was the defining struggle of my era when I was your age. We were, not all of us, but many of us were 24/7, 365 consumed by Vietnam. And there was an element, as I said earlier when I talked about the Palestine conflict, there was an element of this David versus Goliath, a relatively primitive third world country against the world's greatest superpower who's traveling 10,000 miles away to rain death on the people of Vietnam. But could Vietnam have held out without the support of the Soviet Union and China? Of course not. And you want to believe that a tiny, battered people of Palestine can achieve a goal of one state in defiance of all of world opinion at the level of states? That's not politics, in my opinion, for reasons which I already stated. You're imposing a personal opinion on a conflict as if your personal opinion had anything to do with it, which in my view, it doesn't. So some people might say, well, okay, you're looking at the level of states, but what about public opinion? So then ask yourself a simple question. You have friends, you have neighbors, you have coworkers. This is the United States, a major obstacle to resolving the conflict. How many of your friends, how many of your coworkers, how many of your family members would support imposing one state on Israel, which means its dissolution as a state, in defiance of the overwhelming opinion of Israeli Jews? How many people would support that? I don't see any support. I think on any poll, if it were put that way, imposing a unitary state of Jews and Arabs in Palestine in defiance of the desire of the majority of Israelis and entailing the dissolution of the state of Israel, I think you wouldn't even get 1% on the poll. Then what are you talking about? What does this have to do with politics? It's an interesting topic maybe for a philosophy seminar or an ethics seminar, but to my thinking it's completely alien from what politics is about.
Great, thank you. I'm going to be taking more questions. Okay, so I see 1, 2, 3 with the open hand. Is that a question? Okay. And 4. All right, I'm gonna choose 5 people. We will get through another round. 5, yeah.
There's my chance to respond.
Thanks for your talk. Could you please reflect on the state of academic freedom in terms of the issues involved in your presentation? I'm thinking of what's happening now in terms of teaching and research in this area. You did talk about some of the attacks, whatever, that were listed in the New York Times, but I'm wondering about how teaching and research is conducted. Are there pockets of what you would think of as being openness in this regard in their investigations?
Thank you. And you were number 2?
Hi, I have a 2-part question. First, can you explain why you thought of Judaism as a social stigma, like being fad or being ugly? And then could you also address what maybe your goal or your intention was for downplaying anti-Semitism to show people that, if it's to in fact say that anti-Semitism is lesser, or rather to level the playing field for equality to other discriminated peoples. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, my question is a very simple one, and that's, do you think that simple demographics will ultimately resolve the whole issue, particularly given the significantly higher birth rate of Arab Israelis?
Hi, I was wondering exactly why you've spoken out against the BDS movement, and if you could address that a little bit. Thank you.
We'll do 2 more, and then we can get back.
So you spent a lot of time comparing South Africa and apartheid specifically with the modern, the contemporary Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In my opinion, the two are not comparable at all, particularly in terms of regional history. The Dutch and other Europeans in South Africa had absolutely no claim to the land other than colonization, whereas the Israelis have had historical claim to the geographical region that they're in right now for over 2,000 years, well over 2,000 years. So do you not think that that historical claim has, if not justifies what they believe to be their modern claim, then at least the international response?
Hi, thank you for coming again. We spent most of this evening talking about the Israeli atrocities on the Palestinian people, but I think it's often overlooked at what role U.S. plays in what's going on. And do you believe Israel would be what it is now without U.S. support? And do you see anything changing going into the future with how the U.S. deals with Israel?
Okay. The first question was about the state of academic freedom as it pertains to Palestine. I think there's a lot of exaggeration about the kinds of repression that are occurring on college campuses with regard to the Palestine issue. The first point to make, and the most obvious one, is Palestine has won the battle for public opinion on college campuses. That struggle, which took a very long time, is now basically over. It takes a lot more courage nowadays for somebody to openly support Israel than for somebody to openly support Palestine on the college campus. That's why I my sympathies go to the young man, because he reminds me of me in my youth when I would take positions that weren't popular, and you go into the lion's den, and it's a little bit scary. So if he has the courage to express support for Israel, not just in a hand-picked audience, so to speak, like this one, but just in general on college campuses. It's much easier to defend Palestine than Israel in public, on the public stage. What has happened is, because Israel's supporters have lost the battle for public opinion, they're now engaging in a lot of backroom machination, trying to get to administration officials getting the deans and provosts through trustees, alumni contributions, and that sort of thing, and trying to squelch debate and discussion on college campuses through what you might call dishonest means, in my opinion, because they're wholly undemocratic. And there have been some casualties on that front. But in general, Palestine is not a martyr's cause at most universities nowadays, and we should be honest about that. We should be happy about that. There was a time, for example, in the 1970s when the most prominent spokesperson for the Palestinians by a wide margin, and he deserved the recognition and acknowledgement, was Professor Said, Edward Said from Columbia. And he faced real threats to his life. His office was firebombed. There were, as I said, significant enough threats to his life that he had to have, I think it was FBI protection, but that doesn't happen nowadays. We're having a perfectly civil conversation here, no heckling. I mean, we knew what went on in the 1980s and 90s, let alone the 70s. It's a wholly different atmosphere. This security fellow is here, and I'm glad he's getting overtime. But I think he'll even acknowledge this is among the duller events he's had to attend at Wisconsin. I don't think there's any reason. I think there are a lot of academics who like to pose and engage in this kind of pseudo-martyrdom when they're not suffering at all. In my case, in my particular case, I never felt I was denied tenure because of my support for Palestine, because as a lot of you know, my positions tend to be fairly mainstream and conventional. I think that I support international law, the imposition of international law, which means 2 states in the 1967 border with a just resolution of the refugee question. So I'm not particularly radical by contemporary academic standards. I was denied tenure on my own judgment. I was denied tenure and lost any possibility of teaching ever again, at least in the U.S., North America, and Europe, ever again, because I was pretty effective. I didn't just go to wine and cheese parties, which is what most academics do, or they go to conferences, which are not really conferences. It's mostly socializing, often of a very intimate sort. And I was actually reaching fairly large audiences. I did my homework. I was, I think, regarded as being pretty convincing in my presentations. And so it was because of my political engagement outside of academia, my political engagement outside of academia, it was for that reason I was targeted. If I had done what most academics did, publish in university journals, university presses, speak at academic conferences, nobody would give a darn what I said. It was because I think I was reaching large audiences, and also I was doing it for the cause, not for other reasons. On the question of why did I reduce the question of anti-Semitism to just a social stigma, and what was my hidden motive, there was really no hidden motive, there was no ulterior motive. I think I was pretty straightforward. I don't think that being a Jew in the United States is not a heavy cross to bear. Quite the contrary, judging by most people's experiences, there's a certain advantage to being Jewish in the United States. It's not a liability any longer. So I do think it falls roughly in the same category of other kinds of social stigmas, though I think it's, as I said, at the benign pole. I think if most people have to choose between being fat, bald, ugly, short, or Jewish, most people would choose Jewish. And they have to choose between those. It opens many doors, and it closes none, as against the others. And that's the criterion that most rational people use. What opens doors, what closes doors? Ours is the land of opportunity. So you want to see what gives opportunity and what takes away opportunity. Being Jewish does not deny opportunity in our country. That's just nonsense. So, and anywhere in Europe, or I'll say anywhere in Western Europe, I don't want to speak, Germany is Central Europe, Western or Central Europe, or Canada. It's a social cachet, it's not a liability. Whether or not, I don't think this issue that demographics, what the Israelis call the Arab time bomb, namely its very high birth rate or fertility rate, is going to solve the issue. A lot of Arabs also think that. I don't think that's correct. I have a friend, a close friend, he comes from a very large family. He's the eldest of 28, he's Palestinian. And I once posed to him the question whether the demographics will eventually solve the problem. And he said no, because he said, I remember he's an extremely insightful person. He's my moral compass. And he said to me, no, because it's not just quantity, it's quality. It's what kind of people you're producing. Tiny groups of people can do an awful lot of good and evil. You take an event like today. So I don't know how many people are here. How many people are here? 350. If the number of people who actually did the organizing, I'm sure it was no more than 3. It's just a small group of committed people can do a lot. Anyone who was active in the anti-war movement, here I'm referring to the Vietnam anti-war movement, will tell you it was 6 people on campus who were turning the mimeograph machine that was to make leaflets, 6 people taking the leaflets, putting it under everyone's door. So you think there are 2,000 or 3,000 people active in the war? No, it was just 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. It really was. That's what did it. It's quantity, it's quality, it's not just quantity that's going to decide the issue. There was a question asked about my opinions on BDS. I've said over and over again, of course, I support boycotts, I support divestment, I support sanctions. But there are 2 aspects of the BDS movement which I have some degree of differences. First of all, the BDS platform, it says that it's anchored in international law, which I completely agree with. That has to be the starting point, international law. And the basis of international law, it claims some basic Palestinian rights, namely the right to self-determination. And based on that right to self-determination, they then derive 3 other rights. Israel must withdraw from the territories it's occupying, Palestinians must have the right of return, and also there has to be equal rights for Palestinians in Israel. And those 3 rights, in my opinion, actually 4 if you begin with self-determination, those 4 rights are unexceptionable. They're obviously anchored in international law. But rights is not just about for yourself. Rights come with obligations, rights come with responsibilities. If you have the right to walk at the green light, it's because you have the obligation to stop at the red light. With every right, not every right, but almost every right, comes a reciprocal obligation or a reciprocal responsibility. As a matter of fact, if you read Gandhi, as I have, Gandhi was strongly of the opinion that your obligations and responsibilities are more important than your rights, because he's trying to encourage the selfless aspect in people. Our tendency is, of course, to focus what's our right. And Gandhi said, Gandhi, as you know, was trained as a lawyer, but trained as a lawyer, he understood the reciprocal relationship between rights and obligations, but it was his opinion that you should focus as a human being on your obligations and responsibilities first, and then on your rights. So in the case of BDS, in my opinion, they correctly enumerate what are the rights of Palestinians, but they don't at all enumerate what are their obligations. And the first obligation is the reciprocal rights of your antagonist. Israel is a state under international law. That's the law. Now, you might not like the law, but if you begin by saying we're based on international law, then just as you claim rights for yourself, you have to accept the reciprocal obligations and responsibilities to others. Israel is a state under international law, and you have to recognize that fact. You have two choices. One, you could say to heck with international law, or you can say, if I claim these rights, then Israel has those rights. You can do those two things. But what you cannot intellectually and coherently do is claim rights for yourself and then say the other side has no rights. The official position of BDS is to have no position on Israel. You can't have no position on Israel. Israel has the legal rights of a state under international law. You can't have no position. My second and really third objection is, first of all, you couldn't possibly win, for reasons I've already expressed, you couldn't possibly win a broad audience to a platform which discards Israeli rights. It's just not winnable as a practical matter. And secondly, there's a tendency among BDS people, maybe from an excess of enthusiasm, to believe that BDS can liberate Palestine. That's just nonsense. The anti-apartheid sanctions movement had some effect in the South African struggle, but everybody understands that if South Africa was liberated, it was first and foremost because there was a mass movement in South Africa. Everything else was secondary, everything else was ancillary. This idea that in the absence, and right now there is an absence of a mass movement in South Africa, in the absence of a mass movement in South Africa, you can liberate Palestine. It's just, I think, very naive and almost silly. I was asked why I invoked the apartheid analogy. Well, first of all, the apartheid analogy is not really controversial at this point in time. If you read the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, they refer to the apartheid-like regime in the occupied territories. If you look at the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, they refer to the apartheid-like regime in the occupied territories. Jimmy Carter says it's an apartheid-like regime. Israel's former ministers of education, Yossi Sarid and Shulamith Aloni, they said it was an apartheid-like regime. Israel's former minister of, former Attorney General, Michael Ben Yair, he said it was an apartheid-like regime. So it's scarcely any longer a controversial position to claim that Israel has created in the occupied Palestinian territories an apartheid-like regime. Where it does become controversial, and I'm not particularly wedded to any position on it, is whether Israel itself is an apartheid-like regime. There, I think the support for the claim is weaker. But Israel's in relationship to the occupied territories, the kind of regime it's created there, I think it's, as I said, an uncontroversial issue, though it's not a consensus, it's not controversial, that Israel has created an apartheid-like regime in the occupied Palestinian territories. And finally, I was asked about the role of the United States. Well, here I have a slight disagreement with a person everyone in the room is acquainted with, namely Professor Chomsky. It's a question of emphasis. Professor Chomsky tends to put the emphasis on Israel's enabling role, on the U.S.'s enabling role with regard to Israel. And that's, of course, true. Israel couldn't do anything that it does were it not being enabled by the United States. But I don't think it's correct then to make the leap that Israel, because the U.S. enables Israel, it does not make the U.S. the prime mover of the occupation. The United States has no stake whatsoever in Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. If tomorrow Mr. Netanyahu were to announce he's packing up and leaving, he's going to go back to the June '67 border and he's going to resolve in a fair way the refugee question. If he were to say that, the United States would be euphoric. In fact, given that President Obama is a stupefying narcissist, he would probably take credit for it if Netanyahu did that. So the U.S. has no stake in the occupation. If the U.S. supports it, in my opinion, it's primarily because of the Israel lobby. But I think there's a distinction to be made between what you might call the enabler and the prime mover. I think sometimes Professor Chomsky, sometimes he obfuscates that distinction and then holds the U.S. wholly responsible for what's happening. It's enabling it, but the U.S. has no stake in it and would be very perfectly happy if tomorrow would end it. I think it's going to be your call.
Well, unfortunately, we've already gone past time of the full 2 hours of this event, but we strongly encourage and welcome debate and discussion on all of these issues.
Ask to the security person. This woman seemed eager, and I'd like to give the fellow a second chance. So 2 last questions, 5 minutes. Is that fair? Okay. Go ahead. You and then him. And we'll close up.
And sorry, I just want to say one thing first is for people who, because there were at least a dozen people who raised their hands and weren't able to speak, we want to welcome people to join us in room 212 after this for informal discussion and debates. And I will bring you the mic.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you so much for your presentation, but I guess my comments are not towards you, are actually for some things that have been mentioned before. I come from a country, which is Tunisia, where we've lived with the Jewish for more than 3,000 years in a peaceful coexistence. Actually, we have one of the biggest synagogues in Africa, and we have pilgrims every year coming from all over the world. So I guess the point here is, we don't have a problem with the Jewish as a religion. It's actually highly respected, as we call them people of the book. However, our main problem is with Zionism, with the state. Second comment, I remember when Yasser Arafat came to Tunisia to meet Bourguiba, our first president. I was so young, but now I remember that a lot has been said, my mom told me, but then there was a negotiation about two-state solution. Back then, if I was old enough and I understood politics, I would encourage it. However, now, 2015, and after what happened, I'm sorry, but whether we take it all or we leave it all, there is no. Third point and final point, UN. I think my problem with UN, and I don't have faith in UN anymore, as long as there is the veto law, that every single powerful state, Russia, China, France, England, US, whenever one of them uses the veto, there is no recognition of Palestine as a state.
I'm just going to say briefly, because I'm bound by constraints of time, that there are many things I object to in the world also. Probably my list will triple or quadruple your own, because I'm a I tend to be complaining a lot. But that's not really relevant to politics either. Politics is about, these are the constraints under which we operate, and then what's the maximum justice we can achieve within those constraints. And the UN is what it is. It's not likely in the near future the veto is going to be abolished. And then we have to figure out ways, I think, in which to force the United States and its allies to act in accordance with international law and the rights of Palestinians. It's a difficult struggle, but I think if I had the time, I might be able to convince you that it's winnable, given the constraints of the world in which we live. And now the last person.
So thank you for giving me the chance to respond. I know you're in a bit of a rush. First, I'd just like to speak about Netanyahu's speech. He not only did not say that Israel wants a military action on Iran, he actually pushed for increased negotiations to get a better deal so that they can avoid military action, so to dispel that first fallacy that you stated. Also, talking about Israel's neighbors, just wanted to list off some brief quotes from rulers of parties surrounding Israel. Hezbollah, if all the Jews gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of chasing them down around the world. The only solution is to destroy it without giving it the opportunity to surrender, the leader of Hezbollah. The Hamas charter actually calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and the imposition of Sharia law and a caliphate formed in that land. Now to move on to Operation Protective Edge, which you spoke about, was a product of Israel's war machine. It actually started when 3 teens were kidnapped and then Israelis went into the West Bank to try to find them. Then in response, Hamas launched hundreds and hundreds of rockets into civilian populations inside Israel, in which Israel responded with a military operation. Now also, to put in perspective of who cares about civilians, Richard Kemp, commander of British forces, said that the IDF does more to protect citizens and civilians than any other army in the world, even the one that he serves with. Now I'd also like to point out that 3 different times missiles were found inside UN schools inside Gaza. Alongside that, there were 600 instances of civilian populations being used to launch missiles into Israel, including 2 different hospitals, multiple schools, and multiple homes. Now I ask, how could you say that Israel is the war machine who is targeting civilians when Hamas does everything it can to use its civilian population as human shields, and Israel goes, I want to ask you people, do you know of any other army in the world that when they have a target they're going to bomb, they drop leaflets in the local language, they do phone calls, they have sirens? Really, the United States warns people and says, oh hey, leave here, please let me finish, thank you. Well, if you'd let me finish instead of interrupting me, I could...
You've actually had multiple opportunities to speak. You can finish your question, but actually we won't allow an individual to silence the group. There are people who wanted to speak.
No one seems interested in letting me finish, so I'll hand you...
Do you want to wrap up your question?
I'd rather
You have
just
the
not sit
opportunity.
here and be interrupted even more and called out. Thank you.
You're done speaking? You don't want to finish your question?
I'm done speaking.
Okay, well, thank you very much. As a reminder to everyone, room 212, we will be continuing informal discussion and debate, and we welcome all perspectives. Dr. Finkelstein?
Okay. I'm not sure how to answer the last question because it covered a lot of ground. I'll simply say what's pretty obvious, namely that there have been numerous human rights reports issued on the various Israeli operations in Gaza, and all of them have reached, in the case of Operation Cast Lead, there were about, if my memory is correct, there were about 200 human rights reports that were issued on Israel's assault on Gaza, and they all reached the same conclusions, that Israel had committed massive war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the case of the most recent Israeli murderous assault, namely Operation Protective Edge, there have been about 3 or 4 human rights reports issued, but not as many as in the past. And one of the reasons that not as many in the past have been issued is because Israel denied Amnesty International the right to enter Gaza. Israel denied Human Rights Watch the right to enter Gaza. And that's an obvious question. If Israel's record is as sterling as what the young man claimed in his remarks, why is it preventing the most respected human rights organizations from entering Gaza and finding out for themselves? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Finkelstein, for showing up.